Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Welcome, I'm Alison Stewart and I'm the host of this episode of Cut the Crop. So today we're going to be talking about getting your closing date right for your grass seed crops, and we've got Richard Chynoweth from FAR, our herbage researcher, who's going to be explaining to us why it's really important to get those closing dates right. So let's start off by maybe just talking about what's happening with the grass seed crops at the moment? Where are they in their development?
Okay, so main grass seed crops of Italian ryegrass, perennial ryegrass, are sitting there tillering at the moment, just starting to go reproductive. So that'll happen during this early springtime. The cocksfoots and tall fescues will have committed to reproductive development, so they shouldn't be grazed from now on. They should have had their final defoliation back in the winter sometime. So at the moment, they're starting to make up their mind when they're going to flower.
Yeah. So this whole concept of closing dates is a very New Zealand focused thing. Yes. So for those international visitors that listen into sort of FAR's podcasts, just tell us exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about closing dates.
Okay, so closing date is the date that the gate gets shut for the last time. And that's the gate gets shut from the last time from defoliation or grazing. So in New Zealand, it's been grazing, and it's been grazing for a number of years. So the ryegrass seed crop gets planted in the autumn and then grazed through the winter and springtime. And the closing date refers to the time the gate gets shut for the last time. So the paddock is then left and set up for a seed crop. So it's been grazed all winter, shut the gate, that's the closing date. Now we're looking and talking seed production.
And so how does a grower know when is the time to shut the gate?
Okay, so they have to do some work. So really the time to shut the gate is about what we call growth stage 31, growth stage 30 to growth stage 31. So in a perennial crop, or in any grass seed crop, you're actually doing a dissection the same as cereals. So taking some stems, cutting them in half and seeing where the growing point is. So the last defoliation doesn't want to remove too many growing points of a seed crop. So the growing point is the young embryo head, and that's going to give us the seed at the end of the season. So in a perennial crop, you can remove somewhere around 5% of growing points or tillers with a growing point in that last defoliation. That just helps even up the flowering period. So the big problem with a lot of these grasses is they flower over a 20-day period. So you end up with a large variation of maturity. So if you can take the early ones out and actually tighten up the flowering window, that helps with the management decisions, especially around harvest. So in the Italians, they're a wee bit different. You can actually remove a large number of growing points. So we can sometimes we've removed 50% of tillers with a growing point and actually had seed yield responses. That's really quite scary. So from a grower's perspective, you're more looking at taking maybe 20 to 30% of tillers with a growing point. And in Italians, the difference is that they can replace those growing points. So they actually do a little bit of stem elongation at the base of the plant throughout while grazing's happening in the springtime. And if you take the growing point off the top, the buds underneath can actually produce seed heads. So you take one off and end up with two seed heads coming from those nodes underneath. So you actually increase the number of seed heads that you get per square metre. And that took us about 5 years to get our head around how removing so many growing points, which should be embryo heads, can actually increase the number of seed heads at harvest.
So does it matter whether you're grazing with animals or not?
No. Not in the simplest form. What does matter when you decide to graze with animals or take it for silage is the timing you do the last defoliation. So when you're continually grazing something with livestock, the growing point stays close to the ground. So it's just like continually getting whacked on the head. I stay close to the ground. If you're going to take it for silage, you generally will shut the paddock up for 2 to 3 weeks and then take one big silage cut. In that time frame, the growing points will elongate and be further or higher above ground level. So you have to increase the height that you cut at depending on where those sit. So you do have to be careful not to remove too much in a silage scenario. But both options are better than doing nothing.
Yeah. So obviously the closing date changes then every season.
It changes a little bit every season, but generally not by much. So the weather conditions in the springtime may shift the ideal timing or the growth stage maybe up to a week, but it's not actually as much as we would think. So it sort of gets overridden by the photoperiod factors or the day length that drives when things start to go through stem extension.
So if you're a bit early or a bit late with your optimum closing date, what impact could that have on your seed yield?
Okay, so we'll split this into the different species. So in perennial ryegrass, if you're early, then you'll increase the biomass that's present later in the season. So the plant will grow at its maximum rate for longer because it's capturing all the sunlight for longer. And then that will cause us some issues with lodging. So we can pull that back into line with some plant growth regulators, which if we flip across to annuals, you can't necessarily get back. So this is where the mechanisms are different. So in a perennial, we're trying to preserve the number of growing points. We can't graze or mow those off. They have to stay there. So we can only take off maybe 5% of growing points. So that's about keeping the number of seed heads there. If we get it wrong and go too late, we will dramatically reduce seed yield. If we do that by mistake, then all we can do is focus on maximising the production of the heads that are there. So that would be keeping the seed head standing as long as we can, keeping it well irrigated, free of disease, those sort of things. But we can't ever get back the yield that we've lost. In Italians, the story is slightly different. So if we close early in Italians, we're left with a massive amount of dry matter that we've got to try and keep standing. And regardless of how much PGR we throw at it, we can't do that.
Okay.
They will fall over because they'll get 2 metres tall. The Italian ryegrass doesn't get 2 metres tall; it falls over. If we can go too late in Italians, but by going later and later, we cut off more growing points and have more opportunities for them to sprout new heads. So the big issue if we go too late is we run out of time for that to happen. So we need large amounts of water and good fertility levels if we're going to go too late. So generally Italian types in New Zealand, that somewhere in the last 10 days of October would be the optimum time. And if we get into November, then we start getting into needing to keep it wet and very full of nitrogen.
So if you have to end up using a PGR, I mean, are they all much of a muchness, or are there some that are better than others for particular circumstances?
Yep. So for most of these grasses, the Trinex pack ethyl, the Modus type products will do a good enough job on their own. If you've closed early and got large amounts of bulk, then using some chlormiquat chloride or the Cycocel products mixed in there is a good option. They will generally work better to recover yield when you have a large amount of bulk on a perennial as opposed to an Italian. So an Italian, it's really about getting the closing and the grazing under control. That's far more important than the PGR. We can't reclaim the lost yield out of the Italians like we can the PGRs. So there's a big interaction there between biomass and appropriate plant growth regulator programs. So the higher the amount of biomass, the more plant growth regulator it's going to take to keep the crop standing. We want to keep it standing somewhere through 21 days after flowering if we can, and getting that mix is, can be quite difficult at times of what to go about. So if you've closed, generally speaking, pushing the closing date back or grazing a wee bit harder allows you to use less plant growth regulator.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is based on research that's been done over 5-8 years or whatever. Do we think that most growers have a really good understanding now of how to manage this?
I think most growers possibly have a recipe that works, but there are some exceptions to that recipe, and this is where just going by a calendar date based on a heading date for a ryegrass can be a little bit tricky. So if if you don't get out and actually look where the heads are, there can be some issues around chopping them off. And once they're gone in a perennial, they're gone. But lax grazing or lax defoliation during winter can actually encourage some genetics of ryegrass that are out there now to produce what I refer to as false nodes. So they'll actually push their growing point up through the canopy, so it actually sits higher than ground level when you're expecting it at ground level. And then you come through and graze it off and wonder why they don't produce too many seed heads later in the season. Yeah. So there's no substitute for getting out and looking, especially for a new cultivar, and not just using the heading date as a guide. Because the other thing to throw in is access to irrigation, and all these things, nitrogen rates included, all interact and form the puzzle of when lodging is going to occur. So
can you model it?
Modelling around the phenological development's easy, but modelling the actual response to lodging is really difficult. Okay. So there's no good lodging models anywhere. So we're working on a lodging model with Ag Research actually around seeing if we can pick some of this, but it's very, very early days. Yeah. So there is one for, I think it's for oilseed rape, but there's and some evidence that they can be used in barley, but they're very difficult to predict when lodging's going to occur. So experience from last year is still better than a computer model.
Yeah. So if you get your closing date right, then you should be able to get the revenue from the grazing, and then you should be able to get the revenue from the same seed yield that you would get otherwise, or a better seed yield.
Yeah, I think definitely a New Zealand experience that grazing is advantageous from a revenue perspective before closing, but it's actually setting the crop up to be better than it was otherwise. So yeah, we've done quite a few trials, I don't know, probably half a dozen trials where we've actually compared grazing with either no grazing or silage options, and the grazing is always a couple of 100 kilos higher yielding than doing nothing, or well, not necessarily, and sometimes ahead of the silage options, but they're always better than not doing it. Yeah. So grazing, is advantageous from the grazing perspective, but also setting the crop up to be a better crop than it could be otherwise.
Yeah, okay. So this is the time that in the next couple of weeks?
In the next couple of weeks, things are still relatively simple. The time of difficulty comes when we get into October, trying to get enough animals in an area to graze paddocks. So like it's quite simple, or quite relatively speaking easy at the moment, but as soon as lambs start disappearing and we start closing up some crops and the growth rates really pick up, that's probably the bigger problem, is when the late season cultivars, they start growing a lot faster and we can't keep up. It's better that people actually realise they can't keep up and keep grazing at least proportions of the paddock as they should, and look at making silage or baleage out of other areas. When we talk baleage and silage in September, so in sort of October, it is important that people be really careful with where wheel traffic drive across a paddock. So especially trucks, if there's trucks in a paddock, because they can damage the growing points of the crop. And it doesn't take much for a truck and trailer and a baler and things to drive over sort of 20% of your paddock when you add it up. So the trucks are especially damaging. If you can try and get trucks to stick to tramlines and things like that, that can be, you can see some of those marks all the way through to harvest. Yeah. And so they have to be devastating.
Oh, that's great. So lots of good advice there from, he's almost becoming a regular, is Richard. I don't know how many podcasts he's done, but yes, he's my regular, and he's always good value for money. So thanks very much, Richard.
That's all right. Thank you.
And thank you to the listeners, and have a good day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.